My guest on Borders this week is the renowned and much-loved South African Zakes Mda. He was born in Herschel in South Africa in 1948. This was the year when apartheid, the enshrining of white supremacy, became law, subsequent to the election to power of the Nationalist Party. Born to the respected freedom fighter A.P. Mda, what a rich, sprawling life this uncommonly and powerfully gifted man has lived. A childhood inhabited by freedom fighters who would one day soon become legends of Africa's political history. Nelson and Evelyn Mandela, Walter and Albertina Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, the list goes on. A childhood lived out against the dramatic canvas of liberation politics, institutionalized in the African National Congress, the ANC, and the Pan-African Congress of Azania. A youth defined as much by sexual adventures as by the discovery of his own abundant talents as a composer of music, a writer, and a visual artist. That his gifts were significant was obvious to everyone that encountered them. And these gifts would take Zakes Mda on a riveting journey to the pinnacle of the world of arts and culture. Holding up a mirror to the history and current realities of South Africa, his prodigious work includes radio and stage plays and novels that have been translated into 21 languages. For his contributions to the canon of contemporary African literature, Zakes Mda has received some of the most important awards. The Playwright of the Year Award in South Africa twice, the Commonwealth Writers Prize, the Hurston-Wright Legacy Award, the Madonna of Excelsior, the novel in which I encountered the unbridled imagination of Zakes Mda, has been listed as one of the top 10 South African books published in the decade of democracy. Currently lecturing in advanced academic programs at Johns Hopkins University, Zakes Mda was until recently Professor of Creative Writing in the English department at Ohio University. Zakes Mda, welcome on Borders. You were born in South Africa, but you moved from South Africa to Lesotho at a relatively young age. What kind of impact has this migration had on your sense of identity?
Well, the movement from South Africa to Lesotho had many advantages and disadvantages as well. Firstly, I was going into exile, but it was not really my exile in the sense that I was not running away from South Africa because of my sins. I was running away because of my father's sins. Because my father, who was a political leader, was arrested by the apartheid regime. And when he got the opportunity, he managed to escape and ran to Lesotho, which is a neighboring country to South Africa. Actually, is completely surrounded by South Africa. But it was not part of South Africa. It was, as it's still not part of South Africa, even now. It was a British colony then, when my father got refuge in Lesotho. So a year later, I also then went to Lesotho to join him. So as you can understand, it was not a choice of mine. It was my parents' choice. It was apartheid's choice as well. Because after my father had escaped to Lesotho, the apartheid government now began to harass me as well. Sometimes they would fetch me, the police would fetch me from school take me to their police station there and interrogate me for hours and hours. So my mother thought I would be safer if I also went to exile, if I also went to join my father in Lesotho. So that's how then I left. I said it had both advantages and disadvantages, because you can understand maybe I was 12, 13, around there. I would have to calculate to know exactly, how old I was then. Because at that time, of course, you can understand, having grown up in the Eastern Cape then, leaving my friends and so on, going to a new country altogether, it was quite painful. But also leaving my mother and my siblings in South Africa, because they were left there for some time. But the advantage was that going to that new country, which was completely different from South Africa, although it's part of the same cultural milieu, but it was of a different political milieu, you see. And therefore, it broadened my mind, much more. Many things happened there that I would not have experienced if I'd remained in South Africa. My world became much, much bigger, because Lesotho itself was very cosmopolitan. You had people from all over the world there, which thing, growing up, as a black child in South Africa, you were not exposed to that kind of environment. So it was both painful, but it was also beautiful as well.
In your memoir, entitled Sometimes There's a Void, you said that migration affected your sense of belonging. Talk to us about this.
Well, as you know, there are many ways of belonging. In the same way as I wrote, the title of my first novel, that there are many ways of dying. There are many ways of belonging. There are many ways of being black. There are many ways of being African. So belonging also is the same. When I say going to Lesotho broadened my horizons, it also taught me, other ways of belonging. I don't only belong to my family. At that time, my family was broken into pieces now. My mother was somewhere else, and my siblings, then my father and I were somewhere else. We belonged now in a new environment where we were welcome, very much so. So you see, that's when you begin to realize that you don't only just belong, to your family or to your ethnic group or to your nation if you're a nationalist, but you actually belong to Africa, and your Pan-Africanism is strengthened that way. And you also discover that, in fact, even more than just being a Pan-Africanist, you also belong to the world, you belong to humanity.
Tell us about the immense contributions of this illustrious anti-apartheid activist, A.P. Mda. Tell us about his contribution to the struggle as a member first of the ANC and later as a founding member of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania.
Yes, well, when I was born, my father was the president of the ANC Youth League, which he had founded together with other comrades of his, such as Anton Lambede, who actually became the first president of the ANC Youth League. After he died, Lambede, then my father took over as the president of the ANC Youth League. In the same Youth League, that was founded by the youth of the time, such as Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, and other freedom fighters who were later to be better known. So people like Mandela and so on served in my father's executive when he was the president of the ANC Youth League. But then you know that there was that rift that happened in the ANC amongst those people who were called the Charterists and those who were called the Pan-Africanists. In other words, those who believed in African nationalism. My father was in fact the crafter of that ideology of African nationalism as it pertained in South Africa. And then, of course, they didn't agree among themselves, these young people. So that's how then the PAC broke away to form its own organization. My father was never a member of the PAC, though. Why? Because though he agreed with what the PAC stood for, though the PAC actually was based on his own philosophy of African nationalism, he did not believe in the breakaway from the ANC. He believed that they were powerful enough and influential enough to change the ANC from the inside, so that the ANC can become an Africanist, as they called it, can become a fully Pan-African organization. But the other younger people, such as Sobukwe, and Putlagwa Leballo and others, were hell-bent on founding their own organization. So there was that disagreement between him and them, not on philosophical positions, because they were on the same side philosophically, just on that issue of breaking away from the ANC. So he never joined the PAC, but they continued to regard him as the founding spirit of the PAC. For instance, he continued to be very close to Walter Sisulu, Nelson Mandela, and so on. He continued, for instance, Oliver Tambo, when he had an important speech to make, he would ask my father to write that speech for him, long after the breakaway, you see. So you see, it had a practical effect. It was not just a bureaucratic thing that he's not an official member. He doesn't have a membership card. Yes, he didn't have a membership card, but also, he believed very fully in the PAC, but he still continued to work with his comrades in the ANC, and nothing stopped him from doing that. Why? Because he was not a member of the PAC.
The young Nelson Mandela and his first wife, Evelyn Mace, were close friends of your family. In fact, you and your siblings lived with them for a while in Johannesburg.
Yes.
To you and your siblings, he was simply Uncle Nell or Uncle Nelly.
Yes.
But long before he became Madiba, long before that, Mandela represented your father as his lawyer in a landmark lawsuit. So tell us about this lawsuit, Zakes, that Mandela handled on your father's behalf, and why did the case become famous?
Well, the case only became famous because of the personalities involved, Otherwise, it was just a normal run-of-the-mill case, whereby in South Africa during those days, if you were accused of being a communist, whether you believed in communism or not, if you are labeled a communist, then you will be banned or you will be imprisoned and so on, it didn't matter what your ideology was. So what happened was one of the headmen, a headman was a small chief of a village who was well known as, part of, because you see, the apartheid system used Africans themselves to govern themselves or to implement the apartheid laws. In the villages, there would be those headmen and chiefs and so on who were paid by the apartheid government to implement apartheid laws. So one of such chiefs, called Senwamadi, declared that my father was a communist. And which meant then that, by that declaration of that African chief, the apartheid police would have the right, to arrest my father or ban him once, because, there was a law called the Suppression of Communism Act, which loosely defined anything that was anti-apartheid as communist. So my father sued this chief then, Chief Senwamadi, and that case was handled by Nelson Mandela.
Talking once again about your relationship with, the founding fathers of, South Africa's democracy, to your parents, I've mentioned this already. Mandela was Nelly or Nell. Walter Sisulu was simply Boot Walter. His wife, Albertina Sisulu, Evelyn Mandela or Mace, and your mum, Nom Pumelelo, they were all nurses and very close friends.
Yes.
And I was amused to learn that Albertina was a successful matchmaker. And
exactly, yeah.
And Oliver Tambo was a member of your dad's coterie of friends. So, tell us, what was it like to grow up surrounded by these people who have now become legends of African political history?
When you're a child, these are just ordinary people, really, They're just family friends and so on, people you interacted with, not because they were interacting with you, they were interacting with your parents, but then, you were able to get crumbs from that table, snatches of conversation here and there, and therefore you became at least well-versed or a little bit versed with the struggle. You get politicized quite early in life because you are aware what these people are involved in. You are aware who your enemy is and so on. Even among the black people themselves, you see, who is who are the people who are working for the system and who are those who are working for freedom. You also get to know that even amongst those who are working for freedom, they belong in different factions. They don't see things in the same way. There are others who think a particular route would be the best one to take, as opposed to a different route, but they all believed in the freedom struggle. So these, were ordinary men and women with ordinary flaws and so on. They were strict as fathers and so on, in the manner that African men used to be strict those days, and all they were just like that, just the ordinary people.
Your memoir, entitled Sometimes There's a Void. Let me quote from it. Whenever we saw a white motorist, we raised our thumbs up and shouted, "Maibuye Africa." This was the slogan of the ANC. Let Africa come back. Pretty harmless stuff. But of course, you were engaged in more radical activity. So tell us a little about your radical activity, and tell us how and why you were recruited to carry out two political assassinations, which mercifully didn't take place?
Oh, well, that was much later, you know. It was when I was already in Lesotho, where now I actually really got involved in politics in my own right. Remember, I did mention that to go to exile was because of my father. It was not because of my political activism per se, you know. There was nothing really much that I did except shouting those slogans, you know, my Buya Africa and so on, which every other kid perhaps would do, and then, you know, just to provoke the white people, and then you run away. But in Lesotho, then I belong, you know, to the actual political formations. I belong to two formations that were sister formations. One was the PAC, Pan-Africanist Congress of Tanzania. The other one was the BCP, which was the Basotho Congress Party, which was also a Pan-Africanist party and a sister party to the PAC. It was in those organizations, because in PAC then, even when I was at high school, I already belonged in their military wing, which was known as POQO, P-O-Q-O, POQO, which means all alone or by themselves. POQO came from the Xhosa expression, Ama Africa POQO, which means that Africans by themselves. In other words, it was now distinguishing itself from the ANC, which saw itself as multiracial. You see. The PAC now, having taken, you know, the route of African nationalism, their military wing also saw itself as that of Africans only. And of course, they defined Africans, you know, in their particular manner, all those who owe their allegiance first and foremost to Africa. So belonging to POQO, then, of course, it will be obvious that occasionally one would be sent on some mission. We were in Lesotho. Our party had undertaken and made a solemn pledge to the British that it would not launch any attack on South Africa from the soil of Lesotho. But then, after 1966, when Lesotho got its independence from the British, that undertaking fell off or was no longer respected by the PAC. And therefore, under the leadership of Leballo, PK Leballo, Potlago Leballo, he would occasionally, you know, want to launch, you know, some activities on the farms of the Boers, as we call them there. In other words, the white Afrikaner people in the Free State, which was actually against even the ethos of the new Lesotho government after independence, you see, which by and by became very much anti-PAC and pro-ANC, you see. So it was one of such missions, of course, where we would find, for instance, in that one where, you know, into South Africa, the mission was to kidnap, you know, some of the Boer children and into Lesotho. That flopped, of course, because even some of us who were in that felt that it was a very Kakumeni kind of a mission. It was very stupid, and did not wholeheartedly get into that. The same with the assassination, of course, I write about it. It was a very silly mission also. When I was in the BCP, you know, the Basotho Congress Party, which had, a big conflict with the Communist Party of Lesotho. And then, there was all those shenanigans and so on. Yeah, so it's just issues like those, many of which common sense would prevail, and I would say, well, this is not the kind of mission I would want to get involved in. It does not make sense, to me. And I never carried it through, which was fortunate for me, because I would have been imprisoned, maybe even hanged or whatever. There was death penalty in Lesotho for such things.
Sometimes there's a void. We see three gifts emerge during your youth, your childhood, almost at the same time. Your musical gift, you played the flute and composed music. Your gift as a visual artist, your political cartoons were published in established political journals. I think of the ANC and PAC. Your writing talent was apparent from an early age, and you had a story published in the respected Wamba when you were just a schoolboy. Am I right?
Yes.
How did you manage the growth of all three gifts? How did you manage the growth? How did you hone those skills? I mean, all that going on in your background. Tell us about that.
Well, I mean, art has always been part of my life, right from the beginning. It was part of my father's life as well, and my brothers and so on. And I never separated it, from other aspects of life. It was just part of who I was. It was part of my political life as well. It was part of so there was never a time when I just saw myself as Zakes Mda, the artist, on one hand, Zakes Mda, the whatever else, the boy, the later, the man, and so on. It was all intertwined. It was all integrated. I lived art, and I lived politics. I lived. I didn't say, I wake up today, all right, let me do this as a political act, let me do this as an artistic act. The art itself was political because it was part of who I was, and so on. The political itself was artistic, and the what we would call the ordinary life. My father was a very gifted painter himself, but he never did that as a profession. It was just a sideline. It was just something that he did to impress guests. For instance, when we were sitting at table, then he will be sketching something. When we look at it, he has sketched exactly the image of one of the guests there, exactly as he is. And, he became reputed for that. People would say, AP ukukhupha unjalo, which means that AP portrays you exactly as you are. Is able to capture your image exactly as you are, ukukhupha unjalo. But he never pursued that professionally, because at first, as I said, professionally he was a teacher, and then when he left teaching, he went back to serve articles and became an attorney at law, a lawyer. So when we were in Lesotho then, he was working as a lawyer. But even then, as a teacher and as a lawyer later, he was also a conductor of music, a choral music conductor, and later an orchestral conductor. But even those, he was doing them as a hobby, even when he was conducting those mass choirs in the Eastern Cape, which are famous in the Eastern Cape, where you find, choirs from different regions. Then they would all sing together that song, thousands of them, there was that phenomenon then. They were called mass choirs. He would be conducting a mass choir, mainly songs by African composers, such as Moerane, who later became my teacher, my music teacher, and my Latin teacher, J.P. Mahapelwa, and so on. Those are the major African composers here in Southern Africa. So it is obvious then that influences like those, I would grow up with, under such influences, music, especially classical music. Then later on at high school, exposed to jazz. Then I played in an orchestra at high school there, Mr. Moerane's orchestra, a famous composer. I played the flute there. And sometimes I played with him, those were the most glorious moments when we would have, he on the piano, I on the flute. So I was growing up in that environment, in other words, and I was not even aware that there was anything unique about that and being involved in all those different arts. I thought it was a natural thing to do. To me, all those things, it's just art, I wake up one day, I feel like painting a picture, I paint a picture. I wake up one day, I feel like composing a song, I do exactly that. The next day, I will feel like writing a novel, then I'll do that. There's nothing in me that tells me, oh, but that's a different field. Or to me, art is art is art is art.
You said at a stage, the political itself was artistic. What do you mean?
What I mean is there is no line of demarcation between life and politics, life and art. In other words, politics is about life. Is about life. It's about the conflicts. It's about the contestations of power. So is art itself. In our art, we portray the political, whether we like it or not, whether we intend to or not. You see, so. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that, especially in South Africa, our art has always been political. Our art has always been a weapon for the struggle. You see, we used art to mobilize people. We use poetry, we use theater, we use music to share insights about the nature of our oppression, to rally people to fight against that oppression, and so on,
Today, you're the world-renowned Zakes Mda. You don't go hungry anymore. No more escapades with drinking buddies, no more caging drinks. You can pay for your own drinks now if you still drank. Of course, you don't anymore. So tell us about those tough early days when you struggled to put body and soul together as an artist.
Well, I mean, my struggles were not that much compared to struggles, of other artists and so on. Especially because I've always had my parents, who were professional people and were working. Even when, I branched out of the family and was looking after myself. There's always the family. You always know that when things are really, really bad, there's somebody somewhere in the background there who would not watch you and see you starve to death and do nothing about it, So, of course, we all wanted to be independent, and we were independent, My father, the last time he paid any fees for me was when I was at high school, the school fees and things like that. From there onwards, all my education was paid for by myself, by working, by painting, and so on. I've always been self-sufficient. And obviously, during those days, there would be days of suffering, days of hunger. But then our political slogan in the PAC was, service, sacrifice, suffering, those 3 S's. And we were prepared for that because we knew that we were suffering not just for ourselves, we were suffering for freedom.
Let's look at some of the themes you explore in your literature.
Yes.
And the fascinating ways your storylines mirror the history and contemporary realities of South Africa. Let's start with Black Diamond. A quick synopsis. Dan Mateza is a security guard hired to protect the chief magistrate who's on a one-man or one-woman war against prostitution in her town. Don's girlfriend, a former model and successful businesswoman, has grander hopes for him. She wants him to become a black diamond. Who are the black diamonds of South Africa, Zakes? Should we love them or hate them?
Neither, neither should they be hated or loved. It just depends on who those individuals are. This was a term that was given to the new black elite after apartheid, who then, became, many of them, overnight millionaires, getting contracts from the government through what was known as Black Economic Empowerment, which was meant initially an attempt to level the playing field, since during apartheid, black people were disadvantaged, very much so, and most advantages went in the direction of white people, the best education, the best, living conditions and so on. So it was an attempt then by the new black government to address the old situation and redress it by having particular programs that uplift black businessmen, for instance, giving them, those contracts and tenders and so on, in order for them to catch up. So many of them became overnight billionaires. Although the intentions were good then in the beginning, but that became a very important vehicle for corruption, you see, where politicians got involved in that corruption, sometimes using proxies, either in the family or political, in other words, a situation that created a lot of patronage here in South Africa. It's a term that you no longer hear much of these days. But when I wrote that novel, it was a very current term. They were called the Black Diamonds. So one of my characters in that novel is one such black diamond, or an aspiring black diamond.
Black economic empowerment, is that the
Yes.
full name of the scheme that they were beneficiaries of?
Black economic empowerment.
Okay, fine.
And then in later years, like today, when the political establishment realized that BEE, as it was called, Black Economic Empowerment, did nothing for the ordinary black people who are the majority, but only empowered the already empowered, the millionaire and multi-millionaire and billionaires. Then they changed it to BBBEE, which is broad-based black economic empowerment. By broad-based, they say, okay, now guys, we can include you too, little men, there. You see, broad-based black economic empowerment.
Okay.
But it was broad-based in name only, because that practice of accumulation of wealth by the rich continued unabated.
Let's move on now to the Madonna of Excelsior, your famous novel. Most of your novels are famous, but it's based on true events that centered the immorality act of the apartheid era. It was actually my first Zakes Mda read, and it was truly brilliant, Zakes. The way you wrote about the twisted morality of those times and the devastating consequences. And those lurid images of white men, the Boers, in orgies with black women, they have stayed with me. So talk to us a little about the historic 1971 trial and about how you retell it through the trial of the Excelsior 19. Can you remember that far back?
Yes, I do remember, because when these trials began, I was still at high school in Lesotho, at Beka High School, and those towns were not far from, were just across the border in South Africa, because our high school was right at the border of South Africa and Lesotho. So at the border of a province called the Free State in South Africa. And that's where a lot of these cases were happening. So we would read about them in the newspapers, that, 5 black women were arrested for sleeping with maybe such and such a number of white men, or, because the police would go out hunting for these acts of immorality, as it was called. It was called immorality because, it was black and white, having sexual intercourse together. And the police would be out there hunting. You would see a car parked there in the farm. They would creep there only to find that inside there was a white man having sex with a black woman. And they would be arrested immediately. And they would go to court. And they would serve imprisonment for that, you see. But this particular case, which happened when I was at high school, was very special in that it was a big group of black women with a big group of white men, all arrested for having all these orgies together. But the unique thing about this particular case was that a lot of the white men were in fact leaders, whether you are talking local leaders, provincial leaders, or even one or two national leaders of the Nationalist Party, which was the ruling party those days. In other words, the party of apartheid, the party that introduced apartheid and that enforced apartheid. So they were breaking their own apartheid laws, these white men. Thus, what became embarrassing to the rest of the white communities in South Africa. That's what that distinguished that immorality case from other immorality cases. And for the first time, it was before, television was introduced in South Africa, because television was introduced very late in South Africa, because they didn't want, the innocent South African community to be tarnished, by the filth that's happening in the outside world. When we saw television cameras and so on for the first time, they were in that small town of Excelsior. The BBC was there, the American television stations were there, and so on, recording this trial. To the extent that it became so embarrassing to the ruling party that they decided to withdraw the case and to let, everybody go. And that was that. Now, many years later, in fact, I remembered that case. It was now during this era of after post-apartheid, the era of independence. And I wondered, I was in Johannesburg at that time. I wondered what happened to those men who were involved in that case. In other words, those who survived, because others committed suicide, by the way. Others attempted suicide but failed. What happened to the black women themselves? But most importantly, what happened to the children? Because these people were arrested, were betrayed by the children. When the police were walking in the streets of the black township and would see all these mixed race children, then they knew immediately that some shenanigans were happening in that black township. So I was wondering, I wonder what happened to those children who would be adults by now. What would they be doing? So that's when then I drove to that town of Excelsior in the Free State to find some of these people, and to find out what they were up to. I thought I was just doing that in order to write an article for a newspaper called the Mail and Guardian. I found some of them, and they were very cooperative. I found the Afrikaners as well, who were not cooperative at all, who felt bitter that now I was bringing back the past that everybody had forgotten and so on. So I did write then the article for the Mail and Guardian, and that article, became very, very popular, to the extent that I think, maybe I might as well convert my discoveries in this town. Because what intrigued me also was how now all those groups were working together in this new era of, post-apartheid era. So that's how then I decided that I should write that convert that magazine article into a novel. That's how the Madonna of Excelsior was born.
Your epic novel, The Heart of Redness, won the Commonwealth Writers Prize, Africa Region, and the Hurston-Wright Legacy Award in 2002. It's been described as a work of extraordinary richness, suffused with genuine mythic power. A quick synopsis. The novel's villagers are divided into the descendants of the believers and the descendants of the unbelievers. The two groups are at odds over plans to modernize their village, build a vast casino and tourist resort there. A white store owner with a history in the village, his sympathies are with the believers who oppose changes that put tradition at risk. In this globalized world and globalizing world, Zakes, where do you stand in the modernity versus tradition debate in Africa?
Well, I mean, I don't see any such line of demarcation, between modernism and tradition. In fact, it's a fake line of demarcation there, you see, because traditions themselves, those that are still useful, are part of modernity. Let's look at a society like Japan. Japan is a very traditional society, but a very modern society. You see, there's no conflict between, tradition and modernity. There is conflict, of course, if there are still those harmful traditions that must be done away with, in the same way that there are modern practices that must be done away with. See, both traditionalism and modernism have the good and the bad in them, you see. It just depends on our own ethical standing, our own moral standing. So that novel is not even, advocating or saying that, okay, there's this traditionalism, you choose it, or no, you choose modernism. Because even those who are traditionalists not because, only because they reject some aspects of modernism, for instance, where people will come, take over the land, big companies, turn owners of the land into workers, there where now, they've built casinos for foreign tourists will come, and people who used to farm and fish for themselves, they are now mere maids and so on, because they are now working for pittance. They used to work for themselves. You can't say the other one is modernism, the other one is not. The main thing is, even those who are against those casinos there are pro-progress, in that they say, let's have progress on our own terms by preserving our flora and our fauna, you see, our environment, by having tourism that is eco-friendly. What can be more modern than that?
And now my final question for you. What about the writers of the so-called born-free generation? How does their writing differ from South African writers like you, Zakes, who were born either at the dawn of official apartheid or at its height? Tell us what the chief concerns of the born-free are in this rainbow nation, the born-free writers.
Well, I mean, I doubt if they would call themselves born free now. Maybe that term became fashionable in the beginning, in the early years, 1994, and so on and so forth. Because sooner or later, they realized that indeed they are not born free at all. You know, they are still, you know, enslaved by the old order, you know, which is still very much alive within this so-called new order, you see. And the question was, now that apartheid is gone, that's question 1994-95, when we go to Europe, they would ask us that same question. Now that apartheid is gone, what are you going to write about? Why? Because they thought that we only wrote about apartheid. You see? They thought, oh, when apartheid is gone, those poor writers will have nothing to write about. Whereas, in fact, we wrote about conflict, which is what every writer in the world writes about. We wrote about conflict. And as long as human beings are there will always be conflict. That is why, even though there was never any apartheid, say, in Germany, but there are writers there who write. Why? Because there are other forms of conflict that were happening there. Human conflict exists wherever human beings are there. You see that? They thought we wrote about apartheid only, even though we are writing about many different subjects. Why? Because the conflicts that we wrote about, or in South Africa, every conflict would involve apartheid one way or the other. Remember, writers get their material from society. And if they are influential, they themselves influence society. So there's that symbiotic relationship between the writer and society. Now, apartheid was a very absurd system. It was a very widespread system. It covered every aspect of our lives. There was a law that governed every aspect. A law that told you who you could love and who you should not love. Otherwise, you would be killed or you go to prison. That told you where you should live and where you were not allowed to live. Only people of a particular color were allowed to live there. Every aspect, what job you are allowed to do, some jobs were out of bounds for you if you were this color or that color. In other words, there was no aspect of your life that was not governed by apartheid. It means that whatever you wrote about, even if you are just writing a mere love story, apartheid would feature in it. Why? Because in the real life that you're writing about, apartheid featured in your love life. It governed your love life. So there was no way that you could write any story without apartheid featuring in it. We did write about many different subjects, but the commonality would be that in all those different subjects, apartheid would feature. And then people abroad, they thought, oh, they only write about apartheid. But look at those stories. They were about many different things. They were about families, they were about this and this, but apartheid featured. Why? Because in the real life that we lived, apartheid featured there. So the new generation then that was referred to as the born free and so on, live in an environment of new conflicts. Some of them may not be apartheid inspired. Others may be, because apartheid lives beyond apartheid. Remember that. But conflict continues to be there. Gender issues, for instance, continue to be there. Some of which were even neglected during the struggle because they thought the struggle was just black and white. You know, black people against white people. They forgot about the gray areas in between, which should have been addressed even then. They forgot about the oppression of women by men. You see, they forgot about about issues of sexual orientation and so on, which came to the fore now after the demise of apartheid, you know. So all those struggles are there, and the new writers will continue to tackle all those issues, you see.
Okay, that was my final question, and you answered it beyond my dreams, honestly. It was excellent. Zakes Mda, thank you so much.
It is my great pleasure.
It has been an honor for me.
Thank you so much.